Call this work session for the Tigard-Tualatin School Board to order at 5:47 p.m.
So good evening, everybody. What we want to do is use this work session time to provide fiscal updates as we look at having a deeper conversation and having you all take action on a reduction in force later on today. So we have in front of us today Director Reed and CFO C, who will walk us through the status of our current financial situation. And this will help to give you context for our request for the board to consider a reduction in force. And also our controller, Sarah Marasbit, is joining us as well.
All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. We have passed out a current year and then 2-year forecast, which we'll refer to in a little bit. If we could have the next slide, please. All right, so we've had a couple checkpoints this year and provided monthly financial updates in the board packets pertaining specifically to the forecast for the 25-26 year. Specifically, when we're talking about budgeting, while we have other grants and sources, we also have our capital project and debt service funds. We primarily focus on the general fund since that's subject to the legislatively approved budget. And then in most recent years, we also track the integrated guidance portfolio of grants, which we'll learn more about during our regular meeting. But that includes pretty significant grants such as the student investment account, as well as high school success and early literacy. But as we look ahead to 25-26, the district is slated to continue to potentially operate in a deficit if reduction efforts aren't made. And specifically as we approach the 25-26 school year, we've continued to use reserves last few years as we've met students where they're at in a post-COVID environment. And we, when we were completing our contract with TTEA, we knew that based off of forecasts that we were kind of at the end of the road in that regard to using reserves. So why do we find ourselves in this position? Like most Oregon school districts, we're continuing to face a decline in enrollment. Our demographer came and shared forecasts with us in January. Part of that is because of birth rates and housing availability, and then that primarily is the driver there. We're also, of course, facing inflationary cost factors, and as well as just the condition of state school funding, which I'll show a slide later. The other thing that we discussed, you might remember in October, were financially unfunded education requirements. The legislature has passed certain components of compensation, such as unemployment, expansion of unemployment benefits, as well as paid family medical leave, which has increased our district absences. And so that has risen to increase payroll costs. And then, of course, I believe it was at the end of February, might be early March, when Director Kinch and I came and shared about just the changes in special education and the costs associated with serving our students. So if we want to turn to the financial forecast, I also brought copies of what the board reviewed when they approved the 24-25 budget, if you'd like to look at those as comparisons. But you can see we have the 25-26 pro forma budget. This is reflecting the $11.36 billion state school fund allocation that's currently included in the governor's recommended budget, with a 49% recognition of revenue in the first year. It also shows a slight increase to local option levy. And then our other operating revenue is where you will see a decline. So part of this school year, we used some service credits that are a non-repeating revenue source. And then just as we've trued up investment income, specifically as your surplus cash is less, you have less to invest and recognize additional investment income. But we really tried to true up all of our operating revenue to have a consistent expectation of what receipts we would experience. So that brings total operating revenue next year to be an estimated $178.5 million. We then can look at operating expenditures. Those salary and benefits include the contract with TTEA and some assumptions with what will happen with OSEA because we're currently in negotiations with them. Basically, we've assumed a Me Too for OSEA, which is a 4% COLA and 3.4% health insurance. The other change you might remember is, and we talked about it last month in our financial assumptions, is the new 25-27 PERS rates. So what looks like on paper as a slight increase of about 3% actually makes that cost line increase up to 15%. And PERS continues to be a significant factor for all school districts grappling with state school funding only increasing at a certain rate. So that continues to be a significant cost driver for us. We also have continued to true up some of our most significant non-payroll categories, including sub-costs as well as transportation. And as I mentioned at our board meeting last month, property, just, Oregon's micro climate in terms of forest fires and other losses with winter storms has increased our risk factor for reinsurers. Additionally, sex and molestation statewide, that insurance is a significant, that is something that reinsurers are charging more money to provide coverage for. And so we've been told to expect at least a 17% increase, and I've included a 20% increase just to make sure we are prepared for when we get our estimates in June. We've also been continuing to monitor utilities. While rates had several rate adjustments last year, we've noted that our use has actually decreased because of some of the energy efficient investments we've made. And so we've included a 5% utility cost increase. But then you'll see that with all of those assumptions, we're in a position where we would need to realign the budget, and that is projecting about a $10.7 million budget reduction. And I'll talk about that as we go in through later slides. As we compared assumptions and the different forecasts we've done over periods of time, it was determined that if we are going to be in a process where we're making significant reductions, we would rather just realign and revisit systems in one summer instead of continuing to come back with reduction proposals. And so we believe that, as you can see, if you look over at 26-27, we've included some of our assumptions there. But I would really point to that line of 26-27 attrition and or reductions. It's a pretty negligible amount that we think could most likely be, it's about $500,000, and we believe that that could be absorbed through attrition or just continuing to realign staffing, especially instructional staffing, to enrollment. So that's at least the 3-year summary. Are there any questions about that before I move on? Okay, we can go to the next slide.
Before you proceed, just one thing to note is that a lot of the information that we're going to put in front of you, you've already seen. And so just kind of give us, so we might go a little bit faster through this so we can leave opportunities for questions, because we feel like we've done our best to bring you along in this situation so that you weren't surprised by anything tonight.
Thank you. All right, next slide, please. All right, so this is an updated staffing and enrollment sheet, and if we could click twice, Thor, we just have an update. So our original budget, this was shared at our community budget work group, 24-25 had staffing of 1,335 FTE, and we're kind of bucking prior year trends with our current FTE being lower than budget, and that's largely because of the district-wide effort that was initiated in January, where we did a hiring freeze and really only limited certain jobs to be posted. So at the end of March, prior to spring break, when we were updating the slide for the last community budget work group, staffing was at 1,309 FTE. Next slide, please. So this is an updated graph just showing the state of the state school fund as a percentage of total budget. So the dark green line, that has the longest historical trend because that's the state school fund. You can see that even with an increase of 11.3, or an increase to a total of $11.36 billion, the allocation to K-12 funding through the state school fund is about 30.2%, or its lowest in the last 20 years. The teal line that breaks off from that shows that when you add the funding for the integrated guidance portfolio, including the student investment accounts, high school success, early literacy, EIIS, and other items, that amount goes up to 34.3. And just as a point of, conversation, you can see that amount in 25-27 total is about what the state school fund was as a percentage just 4 years ago. So we can go to the next slide. So I'd like to take this opportunity to discuss reserves, since that's an important facet for the board in terms of governance. Our reserve policy is specified in board policy DBDB, which specifies total reserves of 12% broken out into 3 categories. The first is a 5% ending fund balance. The second is a 5% rainy day reserve, and the 2% is an operating contingency. So the reserve provides stability in terms of budgeting. It also is there when things go sideways or there's unexpected changes. Over the last couple of years, the board has approved a less than 12% reserve, specifically maintaining the ending fund balance and operating contingency, and then letting the rainy day reserve be used to maintain current service level and operations. It's important to note that reserves are considered when you are selling bonds. As we met with our rating agency, though, in the fall, when you look at nationwide averages and tax structures, most ending fund balances where you really start to see, or reserves where you really start to see, rating agencies would like school districts to be anywhere between 16 and 17%. And that's just really different from what Oregon districts do as a regular mode of operating. I think often if you look at the OSBA policy, if you don't have a rainy day reserve, the recommended fund balance can be between 5 to 8%. So you're weighing the benefits of having stability in a savings account with also the emphasis of using dollars on the students you're serving today. So again, we've drawn down about $34 million. Our highest reserve at the general fund was $34 million in 2021. That was the school year where we were operating under, COVID with hybrid operations in the spring. So, for the last 3 months in the 1920 school year, and then almost the first 7-8 months in the 2021 school year, we weren't driving students in buses. We weren't, our buildings weren't open. A lot of times, even if we had a job posted, ironically, people weren't applying for it. There was a lot of opportunity to build up reserves, and so we've consistently used those down. And as you guys know, the 2025 school year, we will end at an 8% ending fund balance as budgeted. This won't be a year where we'll end the year with a significant amount in excess of that 8%. We're working hard to hit that 8%. So the forecast I shared with you includes a 7% ending fund balance. That's the 2% contingency and the 5% ending fund. And a majority of this slide was pulled forward from the prior year, where we made the note that the board's position has been to maintain reserves of 6% or more. So that is where we are with reserves. Next slide, please. So this is different, so when we had community budget work groups, we showed the functional allocation of the budget, because that's the way the functional appropriation is how the board approves a budget. For purposes when we talk about reduction in force or a budget reduction plan, we're going to present you with objects. So we have our 5 different workforce groups listed above with what their budget was in the 24-25 budget, as well as other costs, including purchase services. That's things like the contracted part of our transportation, or if we hire a company to come in to do professional development, or even sports officials at high school games. Those are all purchased services. We then have supplies and materials, both consumable and non-consumable, capital outlay, and then other objects includes things like insurance, dues and fees, and other items, and then of course transfers. So the math is still the same as the community budget work group slides. We're leveraged about 85.5% in staffing. So next slide. So as we shared, we're looking to close the gap by proposing a reduction plan totaling approximately $10.7 million. Again, we had mid-year projections that we were doing in December indicating that up to $12 million over 2 years would be necessary. And as cabinet and other district leaders worked together, we determined that it was best to approach this in one reduction plan where we could specifically look at school support systems and balance the budget with minimal impact for the 26-27 year. Then next slide, please. So just because we're so leveraged in staffing, and that's an area that we've seen in terms of FTE continue to grow despite reducing enrollment, I'll have a slide with some summary of reductions by groups. These percentages, though, show what that group as a total would be reduced by with our reduction plan. So the licensed group would be budgetarily reduced by 8%, classified 2%, confidential managers 11%. That's a really small group. So when something is reduced, the percentage is very high. And then specifically, and then school administrators would be another 2%. Next slide. So here, when you are realigning systems, specifically under these circumstances, there is some need to make additions or investments just because of how job classifications or job titles work out. So the reduction plan is going to close that $10.7 million gap proportionately through staffing. With license, it includes approximately 64.02 FTE. 38 of those are instructional, and that happens just by applying our pre-existing class size ratios to our current staff. So that is not adjusting class size ratio. It is just bringing that into alignment. And then we have our non-instructional staff, which, again, just given the gravity of the reductions needing to be made, part of that school system realignment and calibration is reducing non-instructional licensed staff. There's an addition of 3, so the licensed group would be reduced by $7.6 million. Classified, this really comes down to making some program decisions, some ratio, but specifically looking at grant opportunities and how can we braid or blend and take advantage of vacancies. And so that group has a net reduction of 11.99 FTE for $940,000. And then our administrator and management group reducing by 3 and adding 1 to take care of a changeover on the license side. That would yield $550,000 in savings. The next slide. So part of our 24-25 mid-year budget revision has been trying to look at our non-payroll expenditures. And so this is where just collectively, as we've been, part of the putting together the 25-26 budget was also really honing in on accurate budgets for some of those purchase services I referred to earlier, I'm referring to in the budget document, like substitutes and transportation. We continue to sharpen our pencil to have a good estimate there. But we also needed to absorb expenses that have been paid by one-time reserve funds that aren't being replenished. And some of those funds have just expired. So some things like annual curriculum that's not subject to adoption, but it needs to be renewed every year, that's needed to come into the general fund. And so additionally, there were some FTE and reserve funds that no longer exist or no longer have funds. And so those need to come into the general fund based off of district need. So unilaterally, most schools and support services are tasked with a 15% reduction in non-payroll. And then specifically some items to call out are reducing some of our mental health contracts by the amount of $75,000 and some professional development contracts by another 110. That adds up to the 1.5 and would help us attain that $10.7 million total reduction. All right, so next slide. So this is where I'll let Len speak.
Right, so this evening you will hear from Dr. Uno regarding a declaration of a reduction in force. The TTEA contract requires that the district provides written notice of layoff to individuals 60 days in advance. So that puts us in a position that by April 30th, we would need to notify any impacted staff member of layoffs. And then for classified, it's a 30-day notice, so we would need to do that by the end of May. Okay. Next slide.
It's actually our last slide, so whether there's any comments or any additional questions.
I'll say thank you because this is hard, unpleasant work for sure. And I also know, and I just kind of want to bring this forward, that the cabinet and other district leaders I know have done, and it's been mentioned before, but I think bringing it back when we're talking about programs or sort of service reductions, that you have done a huge amount of work in terms of AROI and really digging deep into what are the things that are the investments that are really important to keep and which ones can we, based on what we're seeing as those outcomes, reduce a little bit. What do we need to plug more into? And so I think it's just worth noting that when we see a list of some reductions in some of those services, that's been very thoughtfully kind of calculated, and it wasn't, nothing's being cut, but really look at like all the work you've done probably since Chicago, and working with the DM group, I think, and really just having that huge inventory of where's our money going, how is it serving our kids, if the ultimate goal is student learning and making sure we are getting outcomes from students that we want, where are we putting those investments, even if that means we have to shave a little bit sometimes. I just wanted to acknowledge that all of that has been layered underneath sort of what this final product is really understanding those specific cuts, and those were really strategically, even though it's not any, like, we don't need to wax anymore about how it's not fair and it's not right and we need more state school fund and all the things. Yes, and here we are, and you've sort of done that work to be like, what's in the next of our control and how are we going to do the best that we possibly can. So I just wanted to bring that forward and say thank you, and this was incredibly helpful. You good? All right.
We just wanted to make sure that the board had, all the information they needed, because I will provide a very abbreviated summary when we meet during the general business session.
And I think the way that you have gone through this throughout the year and been really transparent and really sort of like stair-stepped all of us along the process gets us to a place where we don't have to like all of the outcomes, but we really understand where that process was to get us where we are. So I think that's evident in this very quick
I think that's probably
Q&A.
the reason we don't have
Yeah.
a ton of questions is because you have done a great job all through the year of like, we're not surprised, right? Like, I mean, we've had a lot of information along the way, so I really appreciate all the work that you've done.
All right. Going once, students. Going twice, Moss.
Cost of living adjustment. It's a cost of living adjustment. So Moss, they asked what COLA stood for, just for the record, and it's cost of living.
And that's one of the components that's contracted in negotiations.
All right. And with that, I will adjourn this work session at 6:13 p.m.